We're here with John Stewart this afternoon, and John has consented to talk to us a little bit about his experiences in the years of World War II and any other comments that he wants to make about whatever he wants to say something about. So John, just talk.
Well, thank you, George. It's really an inspiration to me to sit down and talk with somebody about those times during World War II that I had some experience in, which was a lot different from a lot of other men and women. And we have recorded some of that in writing. I have, as a commissioned officer, I had a copy of my orders from the time I went into the service until I came out. My total length of service was, I think, 3 years and 4 months and so many days. And I did not want to stay in the service when I got out. I wanted to come back to the farm and to my wife and little daughter, who was 6 months old when I went overseas, and I didn't see her for a year. And of course, when I got back, she recognized a picture of her dad, but she didn't recognize me in summer uniforms that I had on when I came back. And so she shied away from me for a few days until her mother assured her that I was not a stranger and I was part of the family.
And this is Barbara?
Barbara. When I was in Purdue, the draft was instigated, and I was given a draft number in Tippecanoe County. When I graduated from Purdue, they transferred this draft status to Decatur County. And after 6 months, the local draft board gave me a 6 months deferment to help my dad in his production of seed corn, which at that time was a growing business and was needed in the agricultural production. The draft board also allowed me a second 6 months deferment that I received just before I entered the service in order to continue that service. At that time, we had a hired man by the name of Floyd Wilson, who had been with us from his teenage time until he got married. The draft board agreed to keep him on the farm and help my dad, since my brother Gilman had already enlisted in the Air Force, and here I was enlisted, hopefully, in the U.S. Coast Guard. A friend of mine told me that duty in the Navy was a real good duty on the PT boats, but to get in the Navy officer training, you had to have high school or college trigonometry. My trigonometry at Purdue was listed as a combination of college algebra and trigonometry, and they would not accept that. But they said the Coast Guard would accept high school trigonometry. And so, thinking that maybe I might get in the back way, I came back and talked to the school people here, and they agreed that they would give me a postgraduate credit in high school trigonometry if I could pass a test under Chalmers Oaks. Okay. So, the summer before I went into the service, I reviewed with my wife as she came back down to the farm on weekends and helped me, and I studied, and I passed that test because it was really review on what I'd had at Purdue. And then I was assigned to the Coast Guard Academy, and there were about 300 men in the class that I was assigned to in November of 1942. And we went to New London, Connecticut, and had a very unusual experience, I think, there, because that was my first real military experience. And after the first 30 days, they picked out of the 300 of us, they picked out 70 of us who had the highest grades and transferred us over to the submarine base to take, at that time, very secret anti-submarine warfare training. And I was enthused about this because it gave me an additional challenge to learn something that I knew nothing about. We were training for the wooden hull, 83-foot long submarine chaser that was being used on the East Coast to try to hunt down German submarines. Now, the German submarines could detect the metal hull ship, but they couldn't detect the wooden hull ship.
Okay.
And so they were using these ships. When I graduated from that next 3 months, 90 days, wonders they called them,
That was year 1943,
1943,
okay.
in the spring. They didn't have any ships ready, so they sent us to our home district. But mine was Chicago. And of course, there were no sub-chasers assigned to Chicago. There were Coast Guard people on the Great Lakes. The Chicago office assigned me as a commanding officer of a security detail at Escanaba, Michigan, which is located on the northwest corner of Lake Michigan. Way up there where the snow comes in November and stays until April. Well, my wife was working at the hospital in Chicago. She quit her job to come up, and we just talked together and said, if I was only going to be there for 3 months or 6 months or whatever time, she was going to quit her job and come live with me for that period of time, which she did. I took a train into Escanaba and went to the hotel to stay overnight, and they asked me about what I knew about the smelt run. Smelt is a little fish that they eat the bones and all, I think. And I didn't know anything about the smelt. And boy, they thought I was a dumb bunny coming into Escanaba and not knowing about smelt. Well, I tried to find a place to stay, and I found one, an upstairs apartment with a lady, a widow lady, who had a son in the service, and she had 2 children grown in the town there. But she had the upstairs apartment, and she showed it to me, and I said, I'll take it. And she says, well, do you think your wife will accept this? I said, oh, she'll accept anything I pick out. But she became almost a mother to us. Alberta went to the basement and used her laundry machine, and everything was furnished. We paid $30 a month for the rent of this furnished apartment. But she would bother Alberta sometimes. Alberta would kind of sleep in. I'd go to the office at 8 o'clock, and Grandma Williams would come up maybe about 9 o'clock, and in her robe would sit and talk for an hour, and Alberta would want to do things, you know. Grandma Williams was a sweet lady to Alberta, Maine, since we had no parents there locally. Now that assignment was the security of the Chicago Northwestern Railway ore loading docks. Escanaba is and was and is the only deepwater port on Lake Michigan that loads iron ore that comes from the iron ore mines up near Lake Superior. And they were afraid that somebody would sabotage the Sioux locks, and that way they couldn't ship iron ore down to the steel mills in northern Indiana, in Chicago, East Chicago, and Gary. So they spent $18.5 million at that time to try to build an additional 2 iron ore loading docks, and they were made out of wood. And of course, that was tax money at that time, and very, very expensive. And to get help, they hired people from around the area, and that caused a housing problem in this town, because these men would come and rent rooms and sleep in the same bed in shifts in order to maintain their work schedule. I was a commanding officer there, and I had an executive officer by the name of Joe Terzi. He was an ex-Michigan State policeman. And the man in charge of the fire department detail and security was from Gary, a former police, or former fireman a former policeman in Gary, Indiana. So they did the work for me, and I had a good yeoman that took care of my records. They call him a yeoman. And until they decided that they wanted to cut down on expenses. The cook was a little Jewish boy who bought the food for these about 130 men on a local basis, and he had so many cents per day per man, and he could stay within that budget, you know. Well, they said, let's ship him the food out of Milwaukee, and then send him out of a warehouse there, buy it cheaper, which was a good idea. But they didn't send him a bill on it until the end of the month, and he had a hard time adjusting what he was using for food to what he was spending. And after about 2 or 3 months of that, he overspent his allowance. The second month, he overspent it. The first one, I think I had recorded maybe $150 or so, not too much. The second one was $300 or $400, and the next one was, I think, $800 or $900. And my yeoman came in and said, Mr. Stewart, Joe can't do this. He can't overspend his account. So we called Joe in, and we talked to him about it, and we said, now, you've got to stay within these allowances. And he worked on it, and he got down it. But when the reports finally got into the office in Chicago, the district's Coast Guard office, they looked at this and said, hey, here's this base out here that's overspent their account, and we better have a special board of inquiry going there. So they sent 2 officers up there to investigate this. Well, I was a defendant on it, George, because I was responsible.
You were the commanding officer.
And we explained this to them, and the 2 officers, they understood what had happened, and they went back and wrote up their report. And I have a report in my official file with a slap on the wrist from the district Coast Guard officer saying I should familiarize myself with the U.S. Coast Guard Pay and Supply Instructions, which is a book about that thick, and never let this happen again. So, you see, I was called on the carpet then. But after I was there for a year and a half, our first child was born there. I got an order to go to San Francisco and to Pearl Harbor to report for duty in the combat area, in the Pacific area. And I asked for 10 days leave, and I got that. And we came back to Indiana, and it was a moving experience the night that Alberta took me to the train in Indianapolis. Sometime it was after supper time, because here was this 6-month-old baby girl laying in a crib at Indianapolis at her parents' home. And I was getting ready to leave, and of course the tears did flow, you know. But I got on a train and went all the way to San Francisco and got aboard a ship that had a temporary barracks made up on top of the hold. It was a Liberty ship, they call it, carried freight. And we left San Francisco and got into Pearl Harbor. Actually, we went into Honolulu Harbor and docked right by Aloha Tower. That was a trademark in Hawaii there on the main island. I reported to the district office, and another fella was assigned the same way, and they said to Jim Ficken and John Stewart, you men shall be assigned to LST, I think it was 71, was the number of it. You're to replace 2 officers that are aboard, and so they can come home and you will be on active duty. We had to check in every morning. We had a priority number 4. That was the lowest priority in the Pacific area of anything. They would, a dead body had priority 4 to come back. But we checked in every morning at 10. and every afternoon at 4 to see if our name was up to go fly, And we would have to wait until we get our name on the list, and then it flies to the islands. And that story is a long, long story. So I think I'll quit telling on that one and tell you that I finally ended up on an LST, a different number, in Lady Harbor in the Philippines. And he's told me, he says, Stuart, I don't need you. They just come back from one of the invasions of one of the islands. And he says, I need 20 enlisted men. I don't need another commissioned officer. And he said, I know the commanding officer of the replacement depot in Tacloban on Lady Harbor. He said, I'm going in there tomorrow. And if I can train you for 30 enlisted men, or 20, whatever he'll let me have, I'm going to make the trade. I said, sir, you're in charge. And I'd only been on the ship a few days. And he went in, he got the trade made, and I was assigned to an FS. Now that's a freight supply ship operated for the Army to carry supplies inter-island, and we only had about 40 men aboard this ship. But we carried various kinds of supplies. And the first assignment that I got was the commanding officer said, John, we're going to go up to Manila, and they're short of food up there. You go into the Army base and get enough food for 30 days for all of our men, and we'll go up there and we'll divide up with some of the fellows up there. So I took 2 men with me, went into the Army base, and I told the sergeant in charge, I said, we want a 30-day supply of food for so many days. He went down the list of things he was going to give me, and one of them was so many quarters of beef, Australian beef. And I said, sir, we can't take quarter beef. We always get beef that is boned. The bones are cut out of it, and then they put it in boxes. And we had 3 different colors. You had red beef, and you had black beef, and had blue beef. Different qualities of beef, see. He said, sir, if you get any beef, you have to take quarters. I said, may I see them? And he said, yes, sir. And he took me into this great big cooler. And there was a pile, like a haystack, of quartered beef. And in among it, George, were front quarters and hind quarters. I said to the sergeant, I said, make any difference which ones we take? No, sir. He was kind of teed off of me.
Get rid of you.
Yeah, get rid of me. I said to my 2 men, I said, let me pick them out. And I picked out old hind quarter beef and went back to the ship. So we had some good food for a while. Well, anyway, we got aboard the ship, and then I was in pretty good shape with that small crew for the summer of 1945. And when the war ended, we had a load of 500-pound aerial bombs for the Army in Puerto Princesa, Palawan. And that's the southwestmost island in the Philippines. And we were at anchor there, and when the war ended, we had these bombs aboard. And the night that we got the message from the tower, the Blaker lot, in Morse code, that the war had ended, the searchlights on the ships and up on the mountaintop were swinging back and forth, and the security guards up there that had the machine guns were firing tracers up in the air, so excited about the war is over. That night I sat down and wrote a letter to my mother, and we found that letter after I came home, and I had that letter someplace that I'd written to my mother that night. But anyway, we went up and to unload the Army said, dump over the side. And my captain said, no, I'm not dumping any ammunition over the side until you put it in writing what you want me to do with this. So they finally unloaded it, and we went up to Manila, and we're loading lubricating oil to go to Shanghai, China. And the United States government turned that small ship over to the Filipino government, and sent the crew back to the States, and I liked about 2 months of having enough time in to go back to the States. So I was assigned to another LST that was already loaded with bulldozers, trucks in Manila Harbor to go to Japan to help in the reconstruction. And this was in October after the war ended in August. See. Well, there was a big typhoon hit that area, and our convoy of ships were sent out of Manila Harbor into Subic Bay, which was well protected. And we stayed there 2 days, and then they finally sent us on to Yokohama, Japan. And I got seasick going up there, and I didn't eat a bite. I lost about 15 pounds on that trip, but I stood my watch, and I got up there, and we unloaded the equipment there, and we had a Liberty party for half of the crew. And since I was the newest officer, the executive officer said, "Stuart, you are in charge of a Liberty party." Now, they said, here are the rules. You go ashore, you stay together, you behave like gentlemen, and you come back sober at 5 o'clock. So, oh my goodness, how am I going to keep 50 men together and get them back here, in a foreign town? So, we walked just a few blocks from the dock where we were docked, and I had 5 chief petty officers with me, and I told one of the chiefs, I said, "Gather the men around, I want to talk to them." And I said to them, "Now, gentlemen, you heard what the executive officer said. Now," I said, "I'm going to add something to that. If you get lost from our group, we are not going to try to find you. And you better make doggone sure that you get back to the ship sober at 5 o'clock. We walked another 4 or 5 blocks, and the men began to scatter out like a bunch of quail, And I told the chief, I said, "Call the men together, I want to talk to the rest of them." I said, "I repeat to you, if you get lost, we are not going to hunt you up." Because I wasn't going to try to keep them together. And a little bit, all I had was the 5 chief officers, chief petty officers. And I told the fellows, I said, "I don't know what you want to do, but I want to go up to Tokyo." And I said, "You go do what you want to do." So I was by myself all day long. The rest of the crew, my Liberty crew, were scattered. We could get on a train and ride for about an hour from Yokohama to Tokyo. I got on this train, and it was packed just like the interurbans in Chicago, the trains, just standing up, Well, the freshwater supply had been damaged so bad that the people had to have limited number of showers and clothes washing. And if you got on this train, the odor was just so bad for me that I'm not going to ride on this train. So I got off at the next stop, walked over to the highway, and hitchhiked a ride on the back of a 6-wheeler Army truck from Yokohama to Tokyo. And they let me off up there, and I walked around the Emperor's Palace. It was not damaged, it looked beautiful, and 10 blocks away, everything was in rubble. I had decided that I would not eat anything, or I would not drink anything away from the ship.
You felt safe all of this time, or American troops were all
in October, I was safe as could be.
Uh-huh.
Felt everything was all right. And I got back to the ship at 5 o'clock, and all the men got back, and then we started back for the States. I went to Guam and picked up a load of men and came to Pearl Harbor and loaded on cots in a LST down in the tank deck where they load tanks, They put cots down there just real close. And these servicemen had their sea bags, all their possessions with them, and right to their cot, see. And I forget how many we had, but normally an LST carries 125 to 150 men. And enough food and enough water for them. Fresh water. Well, they didn't have enough fresh water for the So they put salt water in all the showers. And the food, they had a buffet, ran 24 hours a day, that the men could go get something to eat as long as they wanted to. Well, after a couple of days out, these passengers quit taking showers because they didn't like the salt water. Salt water isn't too good for rinsing off, you know. And we got back into San Francisco, and we were authorized to give any crew member 72 hours to go home if he could go home from San Francisco and get back to the ship in 72 hours for Christmas in 1945. So we did that, and the executive officer that was on our ship had gotten to be my real good friend, but the captain was an old salt that he wanted to stay in the service, but he wanted to get transferred to Florida in the Coast Guard. So he got off the ship and turned it over to the executive officer, which was legal. And we didn't see anything more of him. And the executive officer knew that I wanted to go home. I had enough time in there. On Christmas Day, another officer and I went into San Francisco and rented a small hotel room to call home. They told us that you had to be at a phone if you wanted to call back to Indiana, which I wanted to call and talk to Alberta. You had to be at a phone and place your call, and they would put your name on the list and finally get to you 2 or 3 or 4 hours later, depending. Well, we waited there, and I finally got through to Alberta, and that was the first time, of course, I'd heard her voice in almost a year. And she put Barbara up to the phone, and to hear this little 18-month-old girl said, "Hello, Daddy, I love you, hurry home," and you know, the tears just flow. But anyway, the next day after Christmas, the executive officer signed my orders, and so I went into the base in San Francisco. I said, I want to go to Chicago, and my home district was then Cleveland, and I would like to have 10 days leave en route. And the fellow said, "Well, Mr. Stewart, we can't get you a berth," which, if for a commissioned officer, you were entitled to a berth. That's a bed on a sleeper. We can't get you, everything is booked up for 2 weeks. Oh, I said, I can't wait 2 weeks. I said, I'll take a chair, a reserved chair. He said, "Mr. Stewart, we don't have any chairs available for at least 2 weeks. Everything's booked." I said, "You keep trying." So I waited, and later on that afternoon, he came to me and he said, "Mr. Stewart, we are sending a troop car to the East Coast that's filled with enlisted men. That's where they bunk them 3 deep on instead of a regular bunk bed, berth, they were in bunks alongside." And he said, "We've got, I think, 2 or 3 extra beds on that troop car." I said, "Can you put me on one of them?" He said, if you're willing to go with these enlisted men." I said, "Put me on one of them." So I rode on that to Chicago, and when I got to Chicago, I had a little time between trains to come to Indianapolis. So I went to the telephone booth, and I called Alberta again, and again she put Barbara on the phone and said, "Hello, Daddy, hurry home, I love you." Well, I got in, it was after supper time in Indianapolis, and the old train station, you came in up above and walked down the steps to where you meet people. And there she was with this little 18-month-old girl in a snowsuit they had. And so, of course, I gave them all a hug, and this little girl kind of looked at me. And so we went to the car, and Alberta drove, and Barbara stood up next to her mother and looked at me. I said, "Who is this guy?" And after a few days, I put on my winter uniform, because I came home in summer uniform. I put on the winter uniform, and the picture she had was Daddy was in a winter uniform. And so we came home, and I got the 10 days leave en route, went to Cleveland, and they tried to talk me into staying in the service, and I, of course, told them no. And so my actual discharge was in late February. I think it shows in this here in 1946.
Yeah.
Well, war is a terrible thing. And I saw evidence, for example, in Manila, where they were short of fresh water, that the women were washing. They had some fresh water in the city of Manila on the main big wide street, a place for them to have some fresh water to wash clothes. They had places for them to take showers and clean up. And you know that we saw pictures recently in one of the national magazines of the prisoners of war that were taken in the Philippines, that their weight went down to below 100 pounds. You could see their ribs and their side because they were starved, see. Well, there's a lot of things, George, I could probably add to this, but I think I'll quit now, and maybe you will have some questions that you might want to ask me. How about you?
What did Pearl Harbor look like when you got there?
Say that again.
What did Pearl Harbor look like when you got there?
Well, when we came back through Pearl Harbor, of course it was secured, but there was still damage of the ships there. And Alberta and I went back for our 50th wedding anniversary. I went to Pearl Harbor, and we went on the tour to see the sunken ship there. And it was kind of a thought-provoking trip, that here we let the Japanese bomb our ships and our barracks on a Sunday morning when everybody was supposedly to be on the good duty. And if you ever have a chance to read the story of Jack Shriver's widow, she was on the island that day when the Japanese attacked, and so was Jack. And the story that they tell is just real thought-provoking. And my feeling now about, we're talking about war, if we don't stop the terrorists over in Central Europe and in Asia, they're going to be here in our country. We have no choice. All the arguments and the debate that goes on, we have not any choice but to try to stop the terrorists. Because we did get it stopped in World War II. We stopped the Japanese people, and we stopped Hitler, and of course Hitler himself destroyed so many people in the camps. We read about that, and really terrible. And we read about that now, this Saddam Hussein, how many people he put to death. But these things go on. I had an invitation to go to Northern Seminary for their Founders Day this past week. And the fellow who was going to give the talk was a student from Sudan, a master's degree student, that he, at 12 years of age, saw the terrorists come in and kill his mother and father and the rest of his family that were 20 years of age and over, and burn their bodies. And here he is in our country, a Christian, and he says, I'm going to go back and try to take the message back for Christian living to my people back in Sudan. And that would be a tough thing for me to see.
You know, it seems to me that a war like World War II was fought on a much more personal basis than the conflicts we get into now. Because here we are in Greensburg, and it seems like everything's so far away. We're not actively involved in it. Maybe we need to get a little bit different attitude about some of these things that are going on.
Of course, during World War II, of course, we saw that even women started working in factories. That's when women actually started in the factory employee order for the men to go, but we killed so many people in the combat in World War II that we didn't hear about them like we now hear about that. Well, they killed 3 or 4 over in Baghdad, but we were getting ready, and I recited that in my story. We were getting ready to invade the mainland of Japan in the fall of 1945. And if we had done this, my personal feeling is that we would have lost many, many more lives, Japanese and Americans, than what the atomic bomb did when it was dropped. I was not in any combat. I was just right behind it. And I feel for the families, those that have lost, goodness.